Okay, good afternoon. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this speaker event, The Prestige of Peace, the Nobel Prize in Context, a conversation with Asle Toje, a member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee. When Asle was here last year, perhaps some of you were present, he commented that it was no exaggeration to say that the Nobel Peace Prize is the most prestigious prize in the world, and in fact, that reflects well on us as a species, that we took so much importance to a prize for peace. But it must also be added that to be on the committee itself is quite a prestigious honor, as it is a committee of only 5 people, chosen by the Norwegian Parliament, that makes the decision each year on whom to bestow the award, a decision that is eagerly awaited each autumn around the world. The Nobel Peace Prize has been awarded annually in Oslo since 1901, with a number of notable exceptions. For example, no prize was given during World War II between 1939 and 1943. According to Alfred Nobel's will, the prize is to be awarded to the person who shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between the nations and the abolition or reduction of standing armies and the formation and spreading of peace congresses. As I think we can all guess, that definition has somehow been expanded over the years or evolved. Particularly, as we all well know in this neighborhood, the idea of the person has been expanded to institutions, including UN-based institutions like UNHCR twice, the ILO, UNICEF, the UN Peacekeeping Forces, the IAEA, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and even the UN as a whole, along with Kofi Annan in 2001. Asle Toje is one of the newest members of the committee, and so he has a fresh perspective on the deliberations and such. He was appointed for the 2018-2023 term. Before joining the Norwegian Nobel Committee, he was research director at the Norwegian Nobel Institute and a regular contributor to Norwegian foreign policy debates. Since completing his PhD at Cambridge in 2006, Asle has lectured and taught at universities in Europe and beyond. His research focuses on the intersection of security studies and European studies. So he will speak to us for about 15 minutes, and then we will sit on the stage for a bit, have a short conversation before I open it up for Q&A, and we should have plenty of time for questions. Asle, welcome back to IPI. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Adam. First of all, I'd like to thank the IPI for inviting me back. It was a lot of fun to be here last time. I very much look forward to the Q&A this time as well. So I'm not going to bore you too much with my presentation. I just thought I'd give you a couple of thoughts on the history of the Nobel Peace Prize. Alfred Nobel, born in 1833, into, in many ways, a spectacular family, but also one plagued by tragedy. 8 children, only 3 of them lived to see their 21st birthday. Alfred and his brothers and father especially had a complicated relationship. Alfred early on decided that he wanted to be an inventor, registered some 355 patents during his lifetime, following in his father's footsteps. His father, Emmanuel, having invented, amongst other things, the deep sea mine, plywood, and the lesser-known plastic backpack. Alfred invented or stabilized nitroglycerin at the tender age of 29, an invention that made him a huge fortune. He went on to live various places around in Europe. Emile Zola called him Europe's or the world's most rich vagabond. Lived in Berlin, lived in Paris, lived in San Remo, finding it very difficult to connect with people throughout his whole life, being quite honest about it, saying that the only times in my life that I've known happiness is when I have been alone in my lab. And in some ways, it's befitting, although very sad, that Alfred Nobel dies entirely alone in 1896, but not before having penned what has become one of the world's most famous wills and testament in 1895, written at the Norwegian-Swedish Club in Paris. In that will and testament, he institutes 5 prizes, 5 in physics, physiology, chemistry, literature, and peace. As you will probably know, there has later been added a memorial prize in the economic sciences in 1968. When it comes to Alfred Nobel's views on peace, it's very interesting to read his letters from the age, many of which have been saved for posterity. And we see here an Alfred that is torn in the way that I believe many world leaders today are themselves torn. On the one hand, young Alfred protests strongly against Abraham Lincoln and the slaughter of the American Civil War. At the same time, he's making inquiries about how he can sell mines to the American armed forces. He forms a very strong friendship with a peace activist, one of the first, Bertha von Suttner. I believe she is the most strong force behind there being a peace prize. Ingrid Carlberg has written an amazing biography on Alfred Nobel. If anybody's interested in all these issues, I recommend you buy it and read it. It's a stellar piece of writing and of scholarship. Alfred Nobel, he came up with these 3 criteria that Adam noted: the reduction or abolishment of the standing armies, fraternity amongst nations, and the promotion of peace congresses. Ever since 1901, there has been an ongoing debate. And basically, the debate follows much the same causal pathways as you see over the American Constitution. You have the originalists who say that the will should be interpreted as it was intended when written. And then you have the progressives, or the dynamic interpretation, who will say that we have to stay with the times and try to interpret these criteria in the current context. You know, just to give an example, Alfred Nobel would have had no ideas about climate change or about human rights. All of these are issues that have emerged later. And the Nobel Committee in Oslo, 5 members today, as it was when the first award was made in 1901, has gone down the path of a dynamic interpretation. I think when we look back to 2001, when the United Nations was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with Kofi Annan, rest his soul, the committee noted that a better organized and more peaceful world is the purpose of the United Nations, and the only navigable path to peace and cooperation globally goes via the United Nations. And I think in this view, they latch on to one of the great themes of the Nobel Peace Prize. This idea that international cooperation is a primary path to peace. In the years leading up to World War I, this manifests itself with a great focus on arbitration and on the interparliamentary union. This idea that democracy is good for peace, democracy is cooperating, the parliament's cooperating, but also that international courts have an important place to deal with the contested issues. Of course, I think it's very interesting to see that we have almost come full circle, in a sense, when the Nobel Peace Prize for this year is awarded to the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, amongst others, for having agreed to arbitration on the issue on the border disputes between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which is something we see too little, where parties agree in advance they will respect the verdict of the court, which he did. After World War I, focus of the Nobel Peace Prize turns strongly towards the League of Nations, and the idea that through international agreements, we can get to a point where war is made less likely and that even impossible, as with the Kellogg-Briand Pact that tried to outlaw war. I think the Second World War in many ways sobered us all. And in the years after World War II, the United Nations takes up much of the focus of the Nobel Peace Prize with one single issue, eclipsing all others. No other issue has been given the Nobel Peace Prize so many times as nuclear disarmament. Nuclear disarmament is the one issue that the Nobel Committee returns to time and again. In more recent years, we see a prize that after the end of the Cold War has spread out. Prizes are given to more and a more diverse range of topics, spanning from women's rights to human rights to the climate cause, the rights of children. And this all goes into, I would like to think at least, the fraternity amongst nations aspect of the Will and Testament, which has been, by the committee, interpreted as, broadly speaking, the causes of peace, what we know. And I was lucky enough to edit a book that came out last week called The Causes of Peace. And in this book, we look into what prerequisites it will take for peace to hold. Because as we now know, forging peace is only the first step. But to create lasting peace, it takes a lot of preconditions. And the committee has been sampling some of these in the past years. It's going to be interesting to see where the Nobel Peace Prize goes in the years to come. I say that as the most junior member of the five-man committee. When I first came in the room, and you know, the chamber has been unchanged since 1901. It's very heavy, very dark, very somber, and also very plush in the sense that people liked it around the turn of the past century. And I thought, well, this is great. And then the committee leader spoke up, and she said, the youngest member usually gets the sandwiches during lunch. So that is one of my key tasks in the committee. I imagine that you guys have a lot of questions, and I would like to answer them all with one caveat, and that is we are bound by secrecy about what happens in the committee chamber, and that does not only relate to the committees that you yourself have been part of, it also goes back 50 years. What I can do is that I can comment on things that we all have read in books or in the media, but I would like to underline that I do not speak on behalf of the committee. The leader of the committee speaks on behalf of the committee, so my opinions should be taken as such as my opinions, and I just hope that they are informed. Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam.
Great. Thank you so much for that historical perspective on the prize. Your background as a scholar shines through. You know, I'm interested in maybe sort of using that historical perspective to sort of a looking back to look ahead, maybe. You know, you mentioned that international cooperation as a primary path to peace was one of the core elements of the prize going back many years. There's a broad recognition, I think, today that we're living at a particular time that international cooperation is really challenged. And you are a relatively new member of the committee, but you've been a scholar of the prize for many years. You've been working with the prize, so you've seen its development, you understand its development, and you can identify certain periods in the prize's history and how it's evolved over time. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, you and I, but I'm curious, you know, when you think ahead, when you look back in 20 or 30 years on this period of time for the prize, what do you hope to see? How would you like to see this era of the prize, 2018 to 2023 period? How would you like to see that be defined in the future?
Wow, great question. What I would like to see is for the Nobel Committee to take the job that we have been given with the utmost degree of seriousness, because we have this opportunity once a year to shine the light of the global attention at one single issue. So we must choose carefully. I think we all sense that we are living, I was about to say in the end times, hopefully not in the end times, but I do think that many of us feel that we're living at the very end of a period or at the very beginning of a period, and there is a great amount of turmoil now in the world. And at times like that, humanity has shown time and again a capacity for making the most outrageously stupid decisions. And it's not just about, that we don't learn from history, we don't, but also we stop being serious about the dangers that this world holds. And the lessons from the world wars have grown distant to many. And we see today a great rearmament going on around the world. For anybody who reads the CPRI yearbook, you will see that China, the United States, the Arab world, Russia, are arming at a frightening pace. I do not believe that weapons themselves create war. I don't believe that. But weapons make wars much more lethal, much more dangerous and bloody. And I think that once preparations for war are underway, once the idea has been lodged, it can be very dangerous. So I hope that when we look back on this period, the view of the Nobel Peace Prize would be one that focused the global attention on the real issues, the real problems that we face, and highlighting those who are representatives of what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, and to reward that. And that's, I think, as far as it goes, because the Nobel Peace Prize does not create peace. But I do believe it can, in certain circumstances, be a thumb on the scales to help a process achieve the best outcome.
Right. I think it's funny because there's a sort of a contrast there. You mentioned that you've just released a book, Causes of Peace.
Yeah.
And what you described just now seems to be almost going back to the previous perspective of armies building and the need for the Nobel Peace Prize to respond to that. IPI and many others is doing a fair amount of work on positive peace issues, kind of issues that you describe at the center of your book. There's two ways to understand peace: simply the absence of war, that focuses on how to prevent or stop conflict, or positive peace, that looks at more the building blocks of a peaceful society and how you can build those up, and that includes the social, economic, all those things that you mentioned are included in a more of a dynamic interpretation of the standards expressed in the will. By some measures that you mentioned, the prize has shifted more in that terrain in recent years. Do you see that as a continuing trend? Do you see that as something that has legs, so to speak? And where does the dynamic interpretation of those standards lead?
Well, historically, in times of great tension internationally, the Nobel Peace Prize tends to go to the United Nations. It tends to gravitate towards the big international institutions. I do believe that these issues are not necessarily at odds, and I do believe that we see that in this year's award, where the committee highlights, in its admittedly terse justification for the Nobel Peace Prize, underlining how the Ethiopian Prime Minister has brokered the beginning of a peace agreement with Eritrea. That's there at the top, but also pointing to how the release of political prisoners, the restoration of press freedom, the fight for women's rights by having half of the ministers in the cabinet being female, brokering peace throughout the region. And I do believe that these kind of combinations will likely be part of the future of the Nobel Peace Prize, perhaps even more accentuated than it has been in the past.
Okay. I could ask some more questions, but I think I should give the room a little bit an opportunity. Yes, back there, Richard, and then up front, Andreas. We'll take a few, and then you can.
Thank you, Richard Jordan from the Blue Community Consortium, and it's good to see you back here in the room. I asked you a question last year.
I remember.
Mike, thank you. My question this year, there was a General Assembly resolution, 73/329, called Promoting the Culture of Peace Through Love and Conscience, and in which the resolution in the first operative paragraph establishes April 5 as the International Day of Conscience. In your book, do you deal with the role of conscience? Thank you.
Oh, easy question.
Could we
Yeah.
take a
Sure,
collection?
go. Mr. Jordan, great question. Thank you.
One here, Andrea, and then back there. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and then here.
Thank you, Roland Rich from Rutgers University. I know you can't discuss the deliberations in the committee, so this is a more general question, and perhaps you can give me your reaction. But you've given the prize to an incumbent leader, and 10 years ago you also gave the prize to an incumbent leader. And these incumbent leaders can go on to do warlike things. You can never be sure what their trajectory might be. Yes, we have peace with Eritrea now, but I wouldn't put my money on peace in 2020 or 2025. So are there any hesitations about giving the prize to an incumbent political leader?
One more here, and then we'll have come back to you, and then we'll have another round.
So my question is actually on the effect that the prize had on Norway. Because of the prizes, is the only one that is given in Oslo, in Norway. And there is an interesting distinction between Norway and Sweden. So it's an interesting play that he was clearly playing. So he was recognizing something among the Norwegians. And I find that interesting because we live in a world in which we are divided by globalists and nationalists. Mm-hmm. But I find Nobel's solution very interesting because fundamentally it's almost an Islamic solution of saying, let's try to compete in what is good. There is nothing wrong about being Norwegian, and actually it's good to be invited to be peaceful and take peace seriously. So much that Norway has developed a very interesting peace culture, institutionally and so on, that is distinctive even within the same Scandinavian crowd. So I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on the price effect on Norway.
Thank you. Great question. So, Mr. Jordan, once again, you put me to shame. Resolution 7/329 and the culture of peace through conscience. The book does not delve into the question of conscience, I have to admit. And we'll see where that goes. It's sometimes, and this is just my own view, sometimes we can get a bit too abstract when it comes to peace. And I'm all for, the spirit of Woodstock and peace and love and all that. But we do live in a world where, after the end of the Cold War, we saw a spike in conflict. Then conflict started falling precipitously. Then in 2003, this downward trend leveled out. Then in 2008, it started rising again. And now we are back to where we were in 1990 with roughly 50 armed conflicts going on around the world. And to my mind, a peace prize will have to keep a special focus on conflicts and ongoing wars and ending those ongoing wars. But that doesn't detract from. I do believe that peace is a mindset, and if you'll allow the gentleman from Rutgers just going into the Norwegian peace culture, I think part of the reason why the Nobel Peace Prize has become so prestigious has maybe a little bit to do with it being awarded by 5, let's face it, non-entities from a very small country. Norway, we don't have the history of great power politics. The country knows that we live in an international system, we exist in an international system where if the law of the jungle would prevail, we would not exist. And I think that is something that weighs very heavily on the minds of Norwegian policy makers, and which also we are learned in school. There is a great focus on peace in school, and that has allowed us to have a strong research environment around centered in Oslo. But also the Nobel Peace Prize has been lucky in that it has attracted much greater minds than mine to the committee, which has been a foreign policy focus point, a place where people who know a lot about international politics engage and discuss. And the people on the committee, historically at least, have played this role by informing the public discourse, creating a public discourse that is maybe a bit different than the one you would see in other countries, and also untarnished by this the dream of military conquest that we so often see in many countries, and which continues to poison relations between countries to this day about the perceived lost lands that should be returned, and that is, learned in school about this piece of land was ours and it's not ours anymore, and it's a great injustice that has been visited upon us. And I think this sort of nationalism, you talked about globalism and nationalism, this sort of nationalism is clearly detrimental to peace. And this is, I think, what Alfred Nobel was talking about when he's talking about fraternity amongst nations, to foster this culture that we have to understand. And I think this is, the climate change in some ways has been a blessing in disguise, forcing policymakers to think in global terms. This is not an issue that we can resolve on our own. And I am frankly amazed at how far we have gotten. I know it's popular to say that we have gotten nowhere and that we haven't done enough. Being a scholar of international politics, I'm amazed at how far we have gotten, and I'm quite hopeful for the future. Sir, when it comes to the giving prizes to the incumbent, yes. What a troubling question. Yes, the Nobel Peace Prize is not a memorial prize. Alfred Nobel underlined this very, very strongly in the will, saying that in the year that has passed. So in the testament, he very much focuses on, the near term and the people who are actually influencing events. Of course, in 1901, the very first Nobel Peace Prize is given to Henri Dunant, who founded the International Red Cross. Henri Dunant was in an old people's home in Switzerland and had not really done much in the year that passed. So the committee already then showed its independence and from the outset decided to follow its own mind about the causes of peace and who should be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But to a question, because you mentioned Obama in 2009 and Abiy Ahmed in 2019. And last time we were here, we had a spirited discussion about Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. What I can say without breaching any of the promises that I have made is that the committee has a strong stomach, and you have to have a strong stomach if you want to deal with living, acting, practicing politicians. You must always be aware that they might do things that will look very bad. And that is the nature of international politics. And it's not always the fault of the politician themselves. Politicians sometimes have to deal with questions that normal mortals such as ourselves will never face in our lifetimes, difficult choices. And I think for the committee, this hope to be, as we discussed, a thumb on the scale, a whisper in the ear, a burden of the good sort for policymakers might hopefully help them to choose the right decision, to choose the path of peace when they are in these decision-making situations. And we discussed this last time about revoking the prize to Aung San Suu Kyi. Not going to happen. We don't revoke peace prizes. But I do think that what has happened in Myanmar has become a much more difficult topic for Aung San Suu Kyi because she is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate than if she had not been. But that's, like I'm open to disagreement on this. But all I can say is that what we try to do is to know as much as we can, to burrow as deeply as we can into the issues at hand. And we're not looking for saints. We're not looking to beatify anyone. And we're not looking to find out whether anybody has cheated on her husband or been a jaywalker or a member of a radical group in their youth. It's just that the committee needs to know. We don't like surprises. So it needs to have a strong stomach. You should also be well informed. I guess that's the bottom line for us.
Can you actually say a bit more about that process as a former research director of the Nobel Institute? I mean,
Sure.
How does that work? You say because you can't predict what they're going to do, but you need to be well informed. And there's Nobel Research Institute that provides information to the committee.
Absolutely. Nominations are received until the last day of January. The people who can receive who can nominate for the Nobel Peace Prize are the big group are parliamentarians. Second are full professors of history, political science, and peace studies, heads of peace research institutes, heads of state, former laureates, members of the committee, and a couple of minor categories. The amount of nominations we get have been increasing year by year, more or less. Now we routinely get around 350 nominations. So what the committee does is, rather than sort of dip our hand in the hat and pull out a lucky laureate, we try to reduce, like you make a good sauce. So we pick out the ones that we're not so interested in, and then after a series of meetings, we've come down to a manageable amount of nominees, and then starts the process of the scholars, which I was part of that team for some years, being the research director. And it's one of the most fun things you could ever write, because the charge is basically tell the committee what they need to know, but only you, but the scholar will have the full view. So to write short, terse texts that give the committee the information that they need, it's a lot of fun. And after we've gotten down to a very small number of nominees, we reach out beyond the borders of Norway, because regardless of what you're interested in, it's someone who has written a PhD about it. Somebody is the world leading expert on this particular cause. And we try to find these people, and the committee then makes a series of questions that we would like to know more about. Her period in Paris. She spent. We see that she spent 10 years in Paris. What did she do in Paris? Is there anything of relevance for our decision that happened then? These kind of questions. Of course, that was not pertaining to any particular candidate. And then we have the long meeting, and the long meeting is it's painful and it's a lot of fun, because by that stage all the committee members have structured their preferences. So basically, you made up in your mind that I would like to have A, but I can live with B and C, and D, E, and F will not happen on my watch. And decisions are made by consensus, which is a very sort of Norwegian way of doing things. We don't vote; we persuade each other. And I know in some cultures this sounds weird, but as long as you have an open-ended time frame, eventually people will just get so hungry or sick and tired that in the end people will usually rally around one candidate. If not, we'll just have another meeting and do it all again. And that it's an endurance sport in some ways, but it is also a magical process, because in the end, once the decision has been made, and I think that I speak on behalf of past members of the committee, once the decision is made, you console yourself with that decision and make it your own very, very quickly, and own it. And that's how it's done in the committee. We never dissent publicly or to our friends or anything. Any dissent will have to be within the committee. Other than that, you support the decision that has been made and just refer to the one-page text that has been issued along with the laureate.
Although historically there have been dissenting cases, right?
There have been dissenting cases on two notable occasions. The committee was fractured. First time was in 1935. A German newspaper editor, Karl von Ossietzky, was nominated. He was pushed very hard by the scholars writing the reports. He had been imprisoned by the Nazis, put in a concentration camp, and the Norwegian serving Minister of Foreign Affairs and the previous Minister of Foreign Affairs were both on the committee. And we don't take minutes, but looking at the letters of Halvdan Koht, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, it's clear that he was concerned about the reactions in Germany should Karl von Ossietzky be given the Nobel Peace Prize. He leaves the committee, so does Mo Winkel, the other Minister of Foreign Affairs. New members come in, and Ossietzky is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1936. This happens again in the 1990s, over the Peace Prize that was awarded to Yasser Arafat. One of the members felt that his conscience would not allow him to be part of a committee that gave the prize to Yasser Arafat, and he left the committee. In that case, the person will just step out, and someone else that has already been determined will step in. Fortunately, those kind of issues are rare, and Norway, we are not without our pathologies. We really have our pathologies when it comes to foreign policy. They're just a bit different and a bit weird. There are two issues that really sets Norwegian foreign policy alight. The one is, of course, Palestine. Don't ask me why, but Palestine is something that really gets people's blood up. And the other one is the European Union, which we are not members of. Again, something where people will get very agitated. It was, to me, a particular happiness when the Nobel Peace Prize was given to the EU in 2012, because I do believe that the European Union has been a very strong force for peace in one of the most war-strived territories in the world, and a great exporter of war to other parts of the world, namely Europe.
Great, thank you. Yes, here in the back, and then, the next, and then,
So I have two questions, and one's technical. You mentioned that there are three. Sorry, I'm from Patty Torsney from the Interparliamentary Union, which our founders were some of the early recipients of the Peace Prize, Passy and Kremer. So my first question is, you mentioned there are 350 nominations last year. Do all of those people get to say that I was nominated for the Nobel Prize? Because you see that referenced all the time and you think, really? Your mother wrote a letter and you get to say I was nominated? I mean, there's a quality of that, and is that recognized anywhere? So that was technical. And the second one is, building on a couple of the other questions, I imagine, and you're a great researcher, so you've done some research on the impact or the follow-up for the people that have received the prize, and I'm aware of the Nobel Women's Institute, for instance, where they've continued to work on those issues, on peace issues. But is there, and how much does that information of how much the prize caused someone to do even more work, how does that inform the committee on its decisions? And also, I suppose, how does people who really screw up afterwards inform them? But is there ever a case where maybe you don't pull the prize, but you speak out against somebody who is a previous recipient and say, you're not living up to our ideals, or give your head a shake, or something gentle and peaceful?
You can, right next to her, or this gentleman here, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then we'll come to you,
Yes, my name is Thilo. I'm from the UN Secretariat.
Please
And-
stand up. We can.
I should stand up. Oh my
You don't
gosh.
mind.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think you alluded to the fact that there's the issue of course, global warming, climate change, which is looked upon from different angles. But the way I see it, and also Greta Thunberg has alluded to that. I think this is an essential threat to the future of humanity on this planet. Of course, it's a slow process, and it will impact on people in different places very differently. And then there's the adaptation, and then there's the mitigation. And I think more attention also needs to be paid to adaptation. For instance, a country like the Netherlands, over the last decades, they have spent a lot of money to increase their dikes, to do all sorts of stuff. And a country like Bangladesh needs to do exactly the same, basically, but they don't have the resources. Now, where are these resources coming from? Of course, there's a lot of commitment. Yes, we need to transfer more money from the global north to the global south, but the amount of money that is really needed to do what is needed to protect people from the sea rise level and what else is so far very inadequate. Now, I've been thinking about one way to free up money would be to reduce global defense spending, and very few people talk about that, but basically all those, like one example, one sophisticated fighter jet costs, I don't know, hundreds of millions, but you can't shoot down a hurricane, you can't do, a lot of this equipment to deal with the existential threat of global warming is utterly useless. Unless we have a global nuclear war, maybe then we can get humanity extinct fairly quickly, but short of that, global warming, climate change is kind of bringing an end to humanity in slow motion, and not enough resources are leveled against in that. So what are sort of your thoughts, in which extent can the Nobel Committee also push the issue of making clear that a lot of our defense spending is utterly useless in combating the impact of global warming?
And we'll come up front here. Up front here, sorry.
Hi, I'm Dr. Danieli. I think I asked you a question last time too, but I'm not sure. First one is a joke. You bring the sandwiches. What about the coffee?
I bring the coffee too. It's Norway. We're a small outfit. I think we're the only institution in the history of mankind. We have as many employees today as when we started in 1901. It's only 7 people working at the institute. We haven't grown.
But to a more serious vein, very similarly to my colleagues, I want to ask about the issue of inspiration, because prestige to people, to normal people around the world, means also inspiration, something to aspire to. And of course it has to do with morality and viewing the future and the threats we have. So how much does that take, infuse the deliberations of the committee, the knowledge of that? Because, for example, you're not giving the prize for literature, but the current prize given is of great agony for many people. And the other issue, and I'm looking forward very much to reading both your books, both the books you mentioned. How much do you take in your deliberations the knowledge of multi-generational transmission of war? That is that most wars are not just this generation, but they live intergenerationally. How much do you take the future into account in considering the awards? And I know Obama was somewhat considering the future. It took a risk about one speech to look for the future. But I think these are very important issues for all of us, and these are scientifically established.
I think we snatched the mic off of one man in the back, so maybe we can take, we can take one more if you don't mind, and then we'll come.
Thank you for this. My name is Faraz Siddiqui. I'm from UN OCT, and I have a very basic general question. and that is, what is the general criteria to get shortlisted to be in the shortlisted candidates for a Nobel Peace Prize?
That's a very, very helpful question there. Okay,
I'll just do it in the reverse order. Dr. Faresh, was it?
Yeah.
Dr. Faresh, there are no criteria. It's simply the preferences of the members of the committee. We go through the list we do our readings, cursory readings, and within the committee there will be a consensus forming about what issues the members find to be most pressing and most relevant for this year, and also if there are specific candidates that stand out. But we do not have any formal criteria. Dr. Raniere, was it? Yes. Wonderful question about the question of inspiration. We do see that laureates such as Malala Yousafzai captures the imagination of people in a way that that certain other candidates struggle to do, and that's just the way the world is. I think when you tie it into the literature prize, I can't comment because it would be impossible if the committee started commenting on the awards of others. But what I will say is that I think that there needs to be a degree of familiarity. This is my personal view. I think that if the Nobel Peace Prize every year would go to causes and people that an informed newspaper reader had never heard about, I think the prize over time would lose relevance. It needs to speak to the great questions of the day to some extent without being populist. What I find wonderful is that Westchester University down in Pennsylvania have started an honors program, which I've been lucky enough to be invited to help shape, where students use Nobel Peace Prize laureates as the subject matter for their studies, and the leadership aspect goes into ascertaining and discussing the leadership that is shown by various laureates. When it comes to the question of multi-generational transmission of war, what a brilliant question. I haven't given it thought before you mentioned it, and I realized that I need to do some reading as well. You mentioned that there is one more book that I would like to recommend or to highlight, and that is Geir Lundestad, the former director of the Nobel Institute, just gave out a book with Oxford University Press called The Most Prestigious Award in the World, came out this year, where you will be able to read a lot more about the process where Barack Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not too happy about that because he is speaking out of turn and he is referring to issues that should not have been discussed in public. That said, the book is out, and if anybody's interested, have a look. Thilo, from the UN Secretariat, and the question of disarmament and the environment. If only things were so easy, and I see your point fully. It is, Adam said at the beginning that last year I said something about it speaking volumes and saying good things about us as a species, that a Peace Prize is the most prestigious award in the world. It doesn't speak very well of us as a species that in the current context we're ramping up our defense budgets at the time when we're facing a global challenge unlike any we have seen in the past. I think that much work needs to be done, and I do believe that the United Nations will have a core role to play in this. Right now, the United Nations is in a lot of trouble economically, and the United Nations is struggling to deal with the altered power patterns around the world and the shifting balances of power and influence that we see. All I can say is that these are issues that the UN has dealt with successfully in the past. I do believe the UN will be able to do so also in the future. But I do believe that international institution, multilateral cooperation is the path forwards. Of course, inspiring countries, such as you mentioned, Netherlands, can act as an inspirator for other countries. But as you very well pointed out as well, many countries do not have the financial means to do even the small steps that are necessary to safeguard their own populations. And this is a global challenge. And I think this is, regardless of where the Nobel Peace Prize goes, I think that these are issues that we will be discussing very much in the years to come. And hopefully the UN will be able to lead the way, as it has done in the past, on many such issues. Paddy, I only got your first name, but from the Interparliamentary Union, great to see you here. And I think the Interparliamentary Union still has life left in it, and I hope that this new century will bring us as much influence as the past one did. People go around and say that they were nominated. Yes, they do. Which is funny because the list of nominees is not made public. That's also under lock and key for 50 years. So you could tell your friends and family that you have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and we would not speak against it. The only time that I've ever been involved or heard of that we actually delve into that kind of issues, that was that last year we had a forgery, a fake nomination for a candidate. I'm not going to say what candidate, but the nomination was such that we always reach out to the nominators to affirm that we have received it, and then the professor in question said, "I did not nominate this person," and we passed that on to the police. Every year we get questions from people who say, "I was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and is there a diploma?" You know, like a conciliation prize. There is not, sadly.
Runner-up.
We don't give any runner-up medals in the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, here.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Would you care
Sorry,
to...
could you reintroduce yourself again?
Pardon?
Could you reintroduce yourself again?
Yes, Leslie Wilkinson, former senior political officer at the UN. Would you care to comment what impact awarding the Nobel Prize to someone who is incarcerated, what impact does this have, not necessarily on the government that imprisoned the person, but on other governments that have been misbehaving? Is there any way you can analyze that?
This gets actually into the second part of the question there, and others. This question of impact of what is the impact of the prize, I think, is something I'm sensing many are interested in.
It's very difficult to dodge questions here.
How you yeah. How do you consider that?
Mrs. Wilkinson, when it comes to giving the Nobel Peace Prize awarding Nobel Peace Prize to people who are in prison, which we'll remember the case of Liu Xiaobo, who died in this great euphemism, house arrest in China, or Karl von Ossietzky, who was let out of the concentration camp so broken and so sick that he died shortly afterwards. It's chilling, it's bone-chilling to see the documents from Nazi Germany, because Norwegian soldiers who were part of the occupying forces after World War II got into the Gestapo headquarters and took any documents they could find pertaining to the Nobel Peace Prize, and we have them in our vault now. And what you see is that the Germans are very, very concerned about how this Nobel Peace Prize is going to be received. And you can see it's with sort of great glee. They find that public opinion in France hasn't been outraged. Public opinion in Belgium hasn't been outraged. And then they move on to the next discussion. And I can tell you, it's chilling to see this memo that's on a very small circulation. It goes between, Hitler is not part of it, it's Heydrich, the butcher of Prague, It's Göring, Himmler, and Goebbels who are party to this conversation, and they're saying, what are we going to do with Dostoevsky? Are we going to kill him? Shall we send him to Dachau? Send him to a death camp? Or should we just leave him where he's at a milder concentration camp? His health is already broken. Or should we release him and go to Norway to receive the prize? Göring wants to let him go, says, this is just a minor inconvenience, and we have the Olympics in Berlin. We don't need the bad press. Heydrich says, Heydrich is at this time running the death camp, and he says, send him over. I'll know what to do with him, more or less. So they end up, leaving him be. It didn't have a great impact on events at that time. That said, I think it was maybe the finest hour for the Nobel Peace Prize, because in 1935, a great many people around the world, including in the United States and Britain, had yet to understand what sort of regime Nazi Germany was, how inhuman this regime was, and pointing out, giving the Peace Prize to a man who had stood up for the freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the right to criticize one's own government, to highlight when they're breaking their international obligations. It was a bold and brave decision to make, as it was when Liu Xiaobo was given the Nobel Peace Prize. There's little to indicate that changes have been made in China. The incarceration rates for the Uyghur minority is frankly baffling and shocking. That said, I do believe that this searchlight, this spotlight that we can put on issues can help win the international debate and discourse over these issues, but it's rarely quickly. And dealing with authoritarian governments who do not respect human rights, do not respect human dignity, it's unlikely that they would be persuaded by such a gentle nod as an award would be when they stand up to much firmer or harder pressure from great powers. And when it comes to the question that I dodged, Professor Ranieri, I'm sorry, about our capacity to ascertain the impact, and that, Paddy, that also goes to your question about do we sort of give a nod or do we give a wagging finger, you're not doing it right? We don't at all. We are not the custodians of or the masters of the lives of the people who have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. They will have to make their own decisions. We do not comment upon it. But that's the wonderful thing about living in a world with full of great journalists and free media, that there are other people who point this out in very forceful terms when Peace Prize laureates step out of line. But I have to say that for the most part, and there are very few exceptions, the laureates have done great honor to proven themselves worthy of the Nobel Peace Prize, not only before but also after having received it.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's interesting to me listening to you. It seems that there's a really delicate balance that the committee is playing between recognizing, you say there's no general lack of general criteria, but recognizing the words of the will of Alfred Nobel's will to award it to whoever has done the most or best work in the past year, but at the same time looking to influence international debates, have an impact with a real long-term vision, as you say. That's a very delicate, complicated thing for just 5 people in a small room in Norway to
Do you think it would work better if there were more of us?
No, well, it's interesting, as you say, that you have not grown. I wonder, working in consensus, it's part of it. But it occurs to me that it's interesting. Is this because the committee is appointed by the parliament?
Yes.
And thinking about this question of that the award is in some way trying to influence international debates or has that aspiration in some way. Is that debated in Norwegian in the parliament when these appointments are made about what that influence should be?
Fortunately, the appointing members for the Nobel Committee is not a very politicized issue in Norway. Normally, the parties, the committee roughly reflects the political makeup of the parliament. So you will have your social democrats, you'll have your liberals, you'll have your conservatives, and sometimes socialists or other parts of the political tribe. What I can say is that the will and testament is the beginning of the process, and it's kept very much at the forefront of the thoughts of the members of the committee. When it comes to your question about influencing events, I think it's important not to get ahead of oneself. We do get, the great thing about getting so many nominees is that we get a lot of worthy nominees. And so we're spoiled for choice in the decision. It's the desire to be relevant is not the prevailing desire. But that said, I think when you look back on the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, that right now, let me see, 131 laureates, out of which 105 are individuals, 26 organizations, and so far 12 women have received the Nobel Peace Prize. This is sort of, trying to find the right balance, because the Nobel Peace Prize, during the first years, it was awarded to white men, and that was because white men was leading the world, and that is not the case anymore. The world has become globalized, and I think that we do try to not put ourselves in a position where we judge different actors by different standards, and that if a European would do something, we would applaud it, and if it happens in Africa, we would go like, well, it's probably not going to work out, and that is the issue that we raised in a past question about this year's award. I think that there is a tendency, at least in Europe, to be a bit even cavalier about developments in Africa. That a lot of the people who are experts on Africa have themselves been disappointed so many times that they have become a little bit cynical. I think that is an impulse that we need to check. Developments in Africa and in the Middle East, these are areas where many of the world's conflicts are going on, and these are areas that therefore must receive special attention. And if that means that we just have to really read up on the politics, the tribal politics, the religious affairs of countries that we know little about before we start the process, so be it.
Great. Okay, we'll have one more question and then.
Hi, my name is Aileen from the World Youth Alliance, and my question is, does the committee sometimes feel that some of the awards, the people they award, based on are contrary to public opinion, based on the reactions that the world gives? Like, how does the committee deal with such reactions if they are opposed to, if the world generally is opposed to the people you award the Nobel Peace Prize? Yeah.
Oh, we just treat that as politicians do. So if the world is applauding, we will say, yes, we got it right. And if they're not applauding, we will just say, well, we'll be right in the long run. No, but seriously, the Nobel Peace Prize is always controversial. There are always some people who feel that this laureate was the wrong one. Often, these people would have nominated somebody or have a different person or organization that they feel would be more worthy. And I think, especially when dealing with countries that are divided by a great many fault lines, you will see within countries such as, to give you an example, Kailash Satyarthi, who's, I have to say, on a personal level, one of my favorite laureates, a wonderful man, works against child slavery in India. His award was not well received in parts of his own community, the Brahmin community, because people felt that it was inappropriate for him to deal with people's domestic servants. Domestic servants in India, to many, are slaves or living in servitude. And many felt that was inappropriate and that he was somehow betraying his own group in the society. This happens. For the committee, we try to take a hands-off approach. Once the announcement has been made, we realize it will live its own life. Sometimes it will be a process of, a rocket-like rise, like in the case of Kailash Satyarthi. His cause, I believe, received global attention and was applauded around the world. And in some cases, we see that some people just can't console themselves. And I think, we discussed the Barack Obama Award is an award that remains deeply controversial. The New York Post gave a 2-page review of Geir Lundestad's book, and I can promise you the New York Post does not usually review books from the Oxford University Press. And the entire review was centered on this one issue, this one award, Barack Obama, and highlighting the issues that they felt justified their editorial stance. So be it. I think that if the Nobel Peace Prize didn't spark outrage and strong emotions, we wouldn't be living up to our reputation, to put it that way. It's been like that for a long, long time, and having gone back through the files, you would be surprised at, take Nelson Mandela, how much negative PR and how much negative publicity was created by this award. A great many people felt that was a particularly bad award. Mother Teresa, same. And now, when we look back on the history of the Nobel Peace Prize, these are 2 awards that are frequently mentioned amongst sort of the stellar moments of the Nobel Peace Prize. For the members of the committee, we work in the dimly lit room. We read a lot of papers. We talk a lot, and then we make our decision. And then after that, we become irrelevant in a sense. Then the spotlight shifts to the laureate, as it should, and the committee shouldn't insert itself between the laureate and his or her work, or the institution's work, and the global opinion. We don't belong there. We just have to do our job as seriously as we can and live with the consequences, knowing, and this weighs heavily on my mind, knowing that we go into a tradition where past committees have gotten it right so many times. So we're on a pretty long winning streak. I think, although there are some awards that remain controversial over decades, Barack Obama and Henry Kissinger are, very high on that list. Overall, I think that most of the laureates form, the gravitas that makes the Nobel Peace Prize what the Oxford Dictionary of Modern History calls the most prestigious award in the world. And I think it's also part of the controversy and of the discussions that takes place around the world about, did they get it right this year? Right. And I can assure you, as once you step out of that, out of the committee chamber, I enjoy reading the international media as much as anyone. I think it's wonderful, and it's difficult to stop because you're so brushed up on it. So I sit there, and my wife is saying, "You're mumbling to yourself," and that I'm discussing with the guy who wrote the paper. Going so that's how it is.
Great. I think that's a great place to end it. I mean, as you said earlier, that the desire to be relevant is not the prevailing concern, but I think it's clear, based upon the high anticipation to the award each year, the reaction, the controversy, and everything. It is extremely highly relevant. The Nobel Peace Prize is, and especially in this time of challenge where international cooperation is at risk, it's perhaps more relevant forever. So we really wish you the best in your future deliberations, and I think you will be getting it right. So thank you again.
Adam, you're too kind. Thank you so much.